Welcome to our deep dive into prepositions. They're these little words that, we use all the time, but we don't always think about them.
Right.
But they actually reveal a lot about how we think about things, space, time, how ideas connect.
Exactly.
And there are so many of them, over 100 in English. We're going to base this deep dive on 2 articles you sent over.
The one's from Ginger Software,
Right.
and the other's from Scribber.
Okay.
It's true, prepositions might seem kind of small and unimportant, but they're really like the glue that holds our sentences together. I mean, just imagine trying to describe where something is or how something happened, without them.
Yeah, it would be chaos.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is a preposition?
Well, a preposition, it's a word that shows how a noun or a pronoun relates to something else in the sentence.
Yeah.
It could be where something is, when something happened, all sorts of things.
So they're like little relationship expert sentences. I like that. But like you said, there's so many prepositions, over 100. That's a lot to keep track of.
It is, yeah. But here's a fun fact. Unlike nouns and verbs, we don't really add new prepositions to English. It's like a closed class of words, which makes you wonder, why would something so important to communication, stay the same over time?
That's a really interesting question. Maybe they're just so fundamental to how we think that they don't really need to change that much. Like our basic understanding of the world.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It might mean that how we see space and time and relationships, that's stayed pretty much the same throughout history.
Okay, so we know what they are, why they're important, but how do we actually find them in a sentence?
Well, you might have heard that thing, anywhere a mouse can go.
Oh, yeah.
It's a good way to teach prepositions. A mouse can go under the table, through a hole, over a book, right? Those words telling you where it is or how it's moving, those are your prepositions.
It's like a fun little game.
Right.
But it's one thing to know what they are, and then another to actually use them right. I know I've messed up prepositions before.
Oh, we all have.
Like sometimes I swap prepositions that mean totally different things.
Yeah, that's a common mistake.
Yeah.
For example, think about in the house versus on the house.
Oh, right. Huge difference. In one, you're inside, and the other, you're probably on the roof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Prepositions need to be specific. And the other important rule is that they usually come before a noun or pronoun, the object of the preposition.
I've always heard you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition. Is that true?
That's actually a myth. Sometimes it just sounds way better to end with a preposition, like someone I can depend on sounds much better than, someone on whom I can depend.
Totally. That other way is so formal.
Right. So now that we've covered the basics, ready to dig into the different types of prepositions.
Definitely. I'm ready to level up my preposition game. Where do we start?
Let's begin with prepositions of time.
Ooh, time travel.
These are the words that tell us when something happens, like before, after, the whole timeline of our sentences. And the most common ones are at, on, and in.
Oh, those are the ones that always trip me up. Is there an easy way to remember which is which?
Well, think of in for bigger chunks of time, like in the morning, in 2024, in the 18th century.
So in is for the big picture. What about on?
On is usually for specific days, like on Tuesday, on January 1st, on your birthday.
Okay, so on is for calendar stuff, and that leaves at, right? What about that one?
At is usually for exact times or special events, so at 3 p.m. at night, at Christmas.
Oh, I see. It's like at is pointing to those precise moments on the clock or calendar. I think I'm getting it. What about prepositions like before and after? Those seem pretty straightforward.
They are. They're like little time markers showing us the order of things. You'd say, finish the report before the meeting, or let's have coffee after work.
Right. They tell us what comes first, what comes next. So we've got at, on, in, before, after. Are there any other time travelers we should know about?
There are a few more that add some detail. You got during for something happening over a period of time, like during the summer. Then there's about, which is for approximate times, like about lunchtime. And then until, which tells us when something stops, like I'll work until 5 p.m.
Wow, so many ways to talk about time. It's like we have a whole set of tools for building timelines in our sentences. But I have to admit, my brain's getting a little full. Maybe it's time to move to a different dimension. Prepositions of place.
Got it. And just like with time, these prepositions help us navigate, but instead of the calendar, it's physical space. You'll notice that some of the same prepositions we use for time, we also use for location.
Okay, I'm ready to explore. Bring on those prepositions of place.
Let's start with our familiar on, in, and at. On is used when something's on a surface, like the book's on the table, the cat's on the roof, the food's on my plate.
So on is for surfaces. What about in?
In means being inside something or within boundaries. It could be a small space like in the box or a bigger area like in France.
Okay, so in for enclosed spaces and at. Does it still pinpoint a specific location, like with time?
It does. At is for specific points, like at the bus stop, at the entrance, at the corner.
Okay, so at is for those precise points on the map. I feel like I could give someone directions just using prepositions.
That's the idea. And just like with time, there are other prepositions that give us more detail about location. We have under, over, which are pretty simple.
Right, like the dog is under the table, or the plane flew over the city.
Yeah, and then we have inside and outside, which are pretty clear too.
The keys are inside the house, the children are playing outside. I'm getting the hang of this.
See, you're a natural. We also have above and below, which tell you where something is compared to something else. For example, the stars are above us, or the basement's below the ground floor.
Wow. There are so many prepositions for location. It's like we have this whole set of tools to create a scene in our minds. But we've talked about time and place. What's next?
Now let's get things moving with prepositions of movement.
Ooh, movement.
These prepositions show how something or someone travels from one spot to another.
Okay, I'm ready for some action. Let's see how these prepositions bring our sentences to life.
So with movement, the most basic one you'll see is to.
Yeah.
It's like it's pointing us in the right direction, showing us where the movement ends up.
That makes sense. Like, we're going to the store, or I sent a letter to my friend. It's like, to is our guide leading the way.
Exactly. But then we've got other prepositions that give us more specifics about how things move. Like through means going directly through something and out the other side. So like walking through a tunnel or driving through a forest.
So through is like a journey with a clear start and endpoint inside something. What about across?
Across means moving from one side of something to the other side,
Okay.
like swimming across the lake or walking across the street.
Okay, so across is about going over something. And then there's into, which suggests entering a space, right? Like the cat jumped into the box, or we stepped into the elevator.
Exactly. And then there's a bunch that show us direction. Up, down, over, past, around. Those are pretty clear, I think.
Yeah, totally. Up for going higher, down for lower. Over for passing above something, past for moving beyond, and around for circling something. It's like we have a whole vocabulary to describe movement.
I like that. It's like we're choreographing the action with prepositions. But there's another interesting thing about prepositions we should talk about, what we call dependent prepositions.
Dependent prepositions? What are those?
These are prepositions that are kind of stuck with certain nouns or verbs. It's like they always go together. The noun or verb needs that specific preposition to make sense.
Oh, interesting. So they're like partners working as a team to create a specific meaning?
Yeah, exactly. For example, one of your articles says, the author demonstrates a deep knowledge of linguistics. You wouldn't say knowledge for linguistics or knowledge with linguistics.
Right.
It has to be knowledge of.
It just sounds wrong any other way. Are there any rules for which prepositions go with which nouns?
Not really any hard and fast rules. It's more about recognizing common pairings. You just have to see how they're used.
So it's another one of those things where you learn by seeing and hearing lots of examples.
Exactly. The more you read and listen, the more you'll naturally pick up on these pairings.
Okay. What about verbs? Do they have dependent prepositions too?
Oh yeah, definitely. Those are called prepositional verbs, and they're important for giving us subtle differences in the action. Like, think about the verb look. It can have lots of different meanings, depending on the preposition that comes after it.
Oh, that's a good example. Look at, look for, and look after are totally different.
Right. Look at means to actually see something. Look for means to search for something. And look after means to take care of something or someone. The preposition totally changes the meaning.
Wow, it's like the preposition gives the verb a whole new personality. Are there any rules for knowing which prepositions go with which verbs?
Well, like with nouns, there are no strict rules, but you'll start to notice patterns.
Like apologize for, believe in, depend on, insist on. The more you see them, the more natural they'll sound.
It seems like dependent prepositions, whether they're with nouns or verbs, they really make English more complex.
Right.
But I guess it's a good kind of complex because it makes us more precise.
You got it. It's this complexity that gives English so much flexibility. And speaking of adding layers, prepositions can also work with adjectives to give us more information.
Oh, yeah, we haven't talked about that. How do they work with adjectives?
Well, think of phrases like married to, interested in, afraid of, good at, or bad at. The preposition tells us what the adjective is focused on.
It's like saying, I'm not just happy, I'm happy about something specific. It adds that extra bit of detail.
Exactly. And here's another interesting thing. Sometimes adjectives that have similar meanings will use the same preposition. Like scared and terrified both mean you're afraid, and they both go with of.
Uh-huh.
Scared of and terrified of.
Oh, that's cool. So there's some consistency there. Right. And we see the same thing with opposites. Good at and bad at both use at.
So while there aren't strict rules, there are definitely patterns.
Absolutely. And as you get used to these patterns, prepositions will seem less scary and more like helpful guides for understanding the subtleties of language.
This is really making me think about English grammar in a whole new way. Before we wrap up, though, we should talk about context.
Yeah.
I have a feeling it's really important for understanding these tricky little words.
You're right. Context is super important for prepositions.
Yeah.
The same preposition can mean completely different things depending on the other words around it and the situation.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's take the word behind. You could say, the car is behind the house.
Okay.
That's talking about location. But you could also say, the team is behind in the score, which has nothing to do with where they are physically.
Right. Behind can mean different things depending on what you're talking about. So it seems like you can't just memorize rules for prepositions. You need to pay attention to how they're used in different situations.
Exactly. You have to develop a feel for the language. It's like becoming a preposition detective.
I like that. I'm definitely going to start noticing prepositions more in everything I read and hear. It's like a whole new world of language has opened up.
And that's the fun part. Discovering these hidden layers and appreciating all the subtle ways language works.
I'm feeling pretty excited about prepositions now. We've covered what they are, the different types, how they work with other words, and the importance of context. What a journey.
It's amazing to think that such tiny words can have such a big impact on how we communicate.
It really is. Before we finish up, what are your final thoughts on why prepositions are so important? What makes them so crucial to language?
You know what's really cool about prepositions? They show us how we think about the world, how we see space, time, all of that. They're not just grammar, they're like tools for our minds.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
Think about it. They help us understand where things are, like
Yeah.
in the room, on the street, under the bridge. But then they also help us understand abstract things like time in the past, at the present, for the future, and even relationships between ideas like connected to, dependent on, opposed to.
So by paying attention to these little words, we're not just getting better at grammar, we're actually learning about how we think.
Exactly. That's why I think you should really pay attention to prepositions, not only in English, but in any other languages you come across. They can tell you a lot about how different cultures see things.
That's a great point. I'm going to start noticing prepositions everywhere now, in everything I read and hear.
And who knows what else you might discover about language along the way.
This deep dive into prepositions has been amazing. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of these little words.
It's been great exploring this with you. And remember, next time you see a preposition, don't just skip over it. Think about what it's doing in the sentence, how it's changing the meaning, what it tells us about how we think.
I'll definitely do that. Thanks for being such a great guide on this journey into prepositions.
Happy to do it.
And to all of you listening, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of language. Until next time,